Kerik, we are so grateful to have you here today and taking time out of your busy morning with us. Um,
Well, thank
we
you.
know that you're running around out there spreading the good word, and we really appreciate your time, taking your time today.
Thank you.
Well, in many ways, many of us in law enforcement would say that we are in a crisis in the country. I mean, you've dedicated your career to serving law enforcement, to fighting crime. No one was more on the front lines in New York City, and certainly during 9/11, than you and Mayor Giuliani. During your time in New York, violent crime, murders dropped significantly. And you know what it takes to fight crime, and that starts with supporting law enforcement. Talk for a minute to our listeners about what you're seeing across the country in regards to the assault on officers and how that, in turn, has opened the door for really criminals taking over our cities.
Well, I think it's a three-pronged problem, right? You have governors right now that are signing into law laws that, such as bail reform, right? Bail reform puts law enforcement in a position where you're locking up a bad guy, in many cases for a violent crime. The judges don't have the ability to hold them. They've got to release them. In New York City, for example, the new bail reform law that was signed into effect about a year and a half ago, 83% of the people that's now charged with gun crimes, they get immediately released. They cannot be held. That's absurd. That's crazy, especially with New York City's gun laws, because they're the strictest in the country. So you catch somebody with a gun, they were involved in a violent crime with a gun, they get locked up, and you can't hold them. You can't hold them on bail. You can't do anything. You immediately have to release them. The judges are in a position now where they cannot look at the defendant's prior criminal record. They have to make a decision only based on what they're charged for at the time, which is completely absurd. It's just nuts. So things like that are basically, you're victimizing the thugs, right? You're emboldening them because they know they can't be held. Then you have judges and prosecutors, especially prosecutors, that are not prosecuting. You have many in the country today, St. Louis, Atlanta, San Francisco, another one in California. They're pretty much Marxist, right? They're extremely left-wing liberals. They focus and target cops more than they do bad guys. Prosecutors refuse to prosecute for things like resisting arrest, which is a violent crime. We have a New York City prosecutor right now that says he will not charge anyone with resisting arrest. Well, that's crazy because it too emboldens the bad people. So prosecutors have to do their job. And then the last one is, I think, the most devastating, and that's where we have, these left-wing, radical, in many cases, Marxist mayors that run cities that are villainizing the police, victimizing the thugs. They're calling for defunding of their police departments, talking about instituting social programs versus public safety and law enforcement. And pretty much, I think the public has to understand, when you defund the police today, you basically take the last 30 years that we've put into policing in this nation, 30, 40 years maybe, the last 30 or 40 years we put into policing, such as resources and training and de-escalation training and less lethal use of force training, all the things that we put into policing to make it better, to make it less confrontational with communities, all that stuff we now take back. We now take it away. We get rid of the training, we get rid of the resources, we get rid of manpower, and then for some reason people think, crime's not gonna go up. The bottom line is you reduce the resources, and the manpower and the training, your crime is going to escalate. And I predicted this the first time it happened in Minneapolis. I said within 6 months, they'll regret what they've done. I don't even think it was 6 months. And they had to call for refunding. They had to hire new cops. They've had to do the same thing in L.A., had to do the same thing in New York City. The bottom line is the more police, the better. And just to touch on something you said, you have cities like, Atlanta, Baltimore, Chicago, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, all these areas that are run by Democrats that are far left-leaning Democrats. In New York City, for example, you have an admitted Marxist, Bill de Blasio. This is a guy that, back in the 80s was supporting the Sandinistas. Every one of these people, they do nothing for their law enforcement community, for their cops. And they never learned from the lessons of New York back in the 80s and 90s when Giuliani and I and Police Commissioner Bratton were in office. The more cops, the more aggressive policing, the more you're going to reduce crime. And we had, at that time, back in the mid-'80s, early '90s, we were running about 2,200 murders a year. 2,200 murders a year. And we dropped that number over Giuliani's term by violent crime dropped by 65%, murder dropped by 70%, and in the black community, where the violent crime was the highest, the murder rate dropped almost 80%. That was unparalleled prior to Giuliani. It's been unparalleled since. But nobody can tell me that it doesn't work because I did it. And when I see what's going on around the country today, it's pretty sickening.
So, Commissioner, the things that you mentioned are exactly what we're experiencing here in Columbus, Ohio. We're putting ankle monitors on thugs who get arrested for gun crimes, and then we wonder why they go out and they murder someone. We had a city prosecutor who dropped 4,000 cases last year in the name of community justice. We have our county prosecutor who covers many of the law enforcement here in the county who ran on a platform last year that said that we need to arrest and go after officers who succumb to the temptation to shoot people. Total false narratives that are becoming rampant. Our school resource officers got voted out of most schools in Central Ohio. We're starting to feel like we've gone down a path that we're not going to be able to recover from. What is your thoughts? I mean, are we getting down to that point where there is no return, or is this just the pendulum that's going to need to shift back the other way?
No, I think it's a pendulum that switches back the other way, and I say that based on the history of New York. Keep in mind, when we were running 2,200 murders a year, there were magazine articles. I remember Time magazine or one of the New York magazines had an apple on the front of it. It said, "The rotten apple, New York City's about to implode." At some point, when mothers are putting their babies to bed in bathtubs, afraid of random gunfire, and nobody wants to live, visit, work, or go to school in areas where they're not safe, at some point, the communities and the people that live in those communities, they start to realize they have no choice, but they have to call in the cavalry. And then they vote in somebody into office that basically puts in the programs, puts the money into cops, does what they have to do, just like Giuliani did, and things will change. But it's a shame that nobody pays attention to this stuff beforehand, because at the end of the day, you lose lives. People are subjected to violent crime when it's needless. It didn't have to be.
It is, it's crazy. And we get a lot of our listeners and people come into our store here that say, what can I do? I mean, we see it on the street. The community is starting to get frustrated because, like you said, it's starting to move to the suburbs. It's no longer in the bad part of town. What can the person do who's listening to this interview, who's listening to the show, just the normal person going about their life? What can they do to change this, to turn this tide?
You know what you do? There's only one way to change it. Only one way. There's nothing you can do singly, but there is one way to change it, and that is you have to vocalize your outrage, and you have to make sure you vote these people out of office. This is all about elections. This is all about moving these radical left-wing Marxists out of office. Because if you don't do that, it's only going to get worse, and it's going to spread. Just like you said, it goes from the bad areas to the suburbs, and the suburbs start to, they start to penetrate the violent crime into those suburbs. You don't have to live like this, but you have to change the leadership. You've got it. And the one thing I've realized over the last few years, our election cycles, when people vote, normally you're thinking the big ticket items, right? You're thinking the presidential election. You're thinking for the House seats, the U.S. Senate seats, and the governor's seat, right? That's what people sort of focus on primarily. No, you got to stop doing that. You got to start getting into your elections at the lowest levels in government. Your PTA boards, your city council members, your county commissioners, your county freeholders, whatever they're called, at the lowest level, start paying attention now to who's getting into those positions. Because eventually, somebody that runs for a local mayor's position winds up as a county commissioner, who winds up as a county freeholder, who then runs for Congress, who then runs for Senate, and they wind up in a position in the White House someday when they started out a radical left-wing liberal. Well, if you vote them into office on the bottom, they're going to be getting voted into office on the top, and you got to prevent that.
And you're so right. I mean, I know you're in town this week supporting Jane Timken for U.S. Senate, and it's people like her that we need to get in there to bring back law and order in our communities. I mean, it is sickening for people like myself who've been in law enforcement for years to see what's going on in our community. It really, like you mentioned at the top, you go through training and years of providing a service to the community just to see it turn around so quick. It's really something. And then you see out of New York City, last week we reported on Mayor de Blasio wanting to pay criminals $1,000 a week. Ones who've been convicted or arrested on gun crimes, pay them $1,000 a week to not commit any more crimes. I mean, how ludicrous is that? At what point is that even something that's you should consider?
Well, you shouldn't, number one. But number two, he tried the same thing in the New York City jail system. Before I was the New York City Police Commissioner, I ran Rikers Island for 6 years as the first deputy and the commissioner, the largest jail system in the nation. We averaged about 133,000 inmate admissions per year. Last year, 2 years ago, he started paying inmates $25 a month to behave themselves. Violent crime within the jail system spiked about 60%.
Wow.
Look, don't embolden the bad guys. Don't embolden the bad guys. If you're not going to hold people accountable for bad behavior, it's only going to get worse. And money is not going to stop it. Their bad behavior is already based. 75% of the violent crime in these urban cities are all based around drugs in the first place. It's all about money. So you're gonna pay them $1,000 a month. Think about that. This is insane. I forget it was $1,000 a week or $1,000 a month. You're going to give them $12,000 a year to behave. Well, who's going to track their behavior? Who's going to track it? Who's going to make sure they're not doing something bad? They're already in for criminal conduct. And you're going to pay them on top of it? It's like a reward.
Right, and they said the people who are running this program are convicted felons. That's what they think is going to be the ones who should advise them, which is just crazy. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I have one last question, though. In many regards, we have been blessed with pushing back terrorists the last 20 years since 9/11. I am scared to death of what's going on in Afghanistan, and what are your thoughts concerning the future safety of the country?
Well, listen, I spent 10 years of my career working in the Middle East, directly working there, living there. I worked for the King of Jordan for almost 5 years. I worked for the royal family of Saudi Arabia for 4.5 years. I can tell you, I'm more frightened today than I was in the aftermath of 9/11, and I'll tell you why. We have completely open borders. This administration has decided to open the borders, and in doing so, they're letting people in that we cannot vet, we cannot monitor, we cannot track. They're sort of like chameleons, and they're going to get back into society in our communities. We have no idea who they are, where they come from, what they're going to do. That's number one. But this thing in Afghanistan is probably more dangerous than anything that's happened since 9/11, and that's because we are now going to take tens of thousands of Afghans, and we're going to bring them into this country as refugees. We don't know who they are. Most of them, we will not be able to vet who they are, where they come from, what their background was, what they were doing in Afghanistan. We're just going to bring them into this country and drop them loose. That's exactly why we need somebody like Jane Timken in the U.S. Senate. That's why, because this administration should not be allowed to do what they're doing. And the only thing that's going to stop them is a Congress that has the courage to stand up and fight back. Right now, I don't see that. And I couldn't be more disappointed by both the Democrats and Republicans who are basically standing on the sideline and letting this stuff happen. It's completely bizarre.
It is. It is. Well, I appreciate so much you taking your time today, Commissioner Kerik. Thank you for speaking out and continuing to push back against what's going on out there in the country. And we'll do our part here locally to keep that fight up in everyone's forefront of their mind. If you're in the area, please stop by and see us, and have a safe rest of your day. And thank you again so much for jumping on with us today.
Thank you. Keep up the great work. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.